one of the first things, one of the big things that you'll find on the practice management exam is that many of the questions are somehow, whether they sound like they are or not, are really about one of the central roles of the architect, which is to kind of create the design team, getting the consultants together, so all the people outside of the architecture firm itself, making sure that you have the right people to do the job that you need to get done, but also creating the team within the firm, making sure that the right expertise level is there, and making sure that the whole sort of group dynamic is going to make sense. And I know this is something, Heather, that you've thought a lot about over the years, and being in very small and very large firms. I'm sure you have a few thoughts to say about the creation of teams for these kinds of projects.
Oh, sure. So right now I'm working more or less by myself, and you wear this hat with every role in it. You're the designer, you're the architect, you're going out there to look at the landscape, you're doing some interior work. That has not always been the case. When I joined a large firm, I was surprised to realize how many disciplines and people were on the project. One of the very first things that we did once a team was in the process of getting started was to make a cartoon set where we would work through the basic pages of an architect or a project that you know that you would have. So you'd go through, and that was kind of able to let us know how many hours, how many man hours, what kind of people that we would need on this project. So if we were working on a hospital, for example, you're going to need a structural engineer, you're going to need a mechanical engineer, an electrical engineer, a plumbing engineer. But even underneath the architecture side, you would have someone that would just look at the project management things.
Right. Project management, wayfinding, all those things that for a hospital would be important. You're trying to sort of line up all those important disciplines and understanding them before the project even really starts. You're sort of laying out how it's going to look, not what you're designing, but all the places for those different disciplines to be able to plug in.
Yeah, so this cartoon set that we do before you even design the project, you're just kind of drafting it out to figure out what you need and who you need. Because even if you have an architect on the job, chances are with such a large project, you're going to need someone that knows life safety really well. You're going to need someone that knows how to plan for equipment, or an equipment planner in an operating room. You may have someone that only deals with the financial aspect of the project.
Yeah, and especially when you get those bigger projects, that you absolutely will. Those will be different people representing the different parts of the sort of important disciplines that are sort of put forward. You mentioned that now you're a single person working on a lot of the different projects. One of the things I can pretty much guarantee, not absolutely, but pretty much guarantee, is that the exam won't really be aimed at somebody doing everything themselves. The exam questions are really focused on maybe not quite as large as a big, thriving metropolis hospital, but something like a junior high school or something where it's a bunch of different disciplines are going to be involved, and the architect plays a sort of key role in defining who should be there, like you were just talking about. For this situation, what are going to be the disciplines and the specific knowledge bases that we're going to need in order to do this, and then making sure that those people are sort of logically plugged in and ready to go at the right time.
Yeah, the analogy that I always like, that I think someone probably said during my undergraduate days, was that the architect's really the maestro or the conductor in an orchestra, right? And then you have the individual disciplines that you really have to start to bring all together to make the whole piece complete.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and that is absolutely the way that the exam will be looking at it. That the position that you are taking while you're reading the exam questions is, okay, I'm supposed to be the conductor. I'm not necessarily supposed to be the person drawing the detail, or the person doing the ceiling finish schedule or something like that, that the role you're playing as you're taking that exam is as the conductor. So you have set up where all the different disciplines sit and how they're going to communicate and how that's going to work. And I think it's, like I said in the very beginning of this, it's really important to sort of separate out those that are part of the architecture office, the people that are within the sort of architecture milieu, and then those who are the consultants that are brought in. Because it's considered, I think, two different sort of sets of communication. One is really about how an office thrives. Do you have people working well together, kind of in an open setting? Do you have a easy way to communicate between different people who are working on the same project? Either through technology ways or just through conversation, or meetings every week, or however it goes. But then there's a more formalized set of relationships to the consultants, because those are contractual, and they're a different sort of set of ways that you start to do those communications. And one of the things you will find throughout the exam, many of you have probably heard me say this many times in different contexts, is that the questions will always fall back on creating a rhythm, so a knowable rhythm of meetings, an understandable system of communication that everybody knows how to plug into. Everybody can see the overall arc, so they know what their part is and when it needs to be done in order for it to make the whole thing sort of go. So I think that really, to Heather, to your point, is that conductor role, right? It's really about kind of making sure that everybody knows when they're supposed to do the thing they need to do in order to make the project work.
Yeah, and I could even go to say that your role isn't even done when the project's done. Some of the biggest learning opportunities I've had have been doing your lessons learned at the end of a project, where you sit back and reflect and go, you know what, that project could have used more communication, or we could have done this up front.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the lessons learned thing is something that is not always done, but it sure should be, because every project you always learn something about the thing, and it's almost always about communication. Sometimes it's about specific materials or something like that, but the architecture discipline is just so laced with communication between all sorts of different players that it really becomes about having a way to talk to each other. And you can so easily imagine questions that could come at you that are things like, here's a bad situation, what should you do? And an A is you should yell at the people. B is you should call your insurance company. The answer is always going to be it should be carefully thought through and brought up at the weekly meetings. It'll be something like that, right? And it doesn't always seem like the obvious answer, because it seems sort of pedestrian, but that's what they're looking for. They're looking for a conductor who can kind of make it all sort of fit together.
Sounds good.
Absolutely.
Having done this for a long time, I can tell you, putting a team together is a kind of fascinating process, because it's partly about making sure all the disciplines are there, but it's also partly about personalities and making sure that everybody can work together and there's a logic to how people work together. So that's a little harder to ask a question about. So I don't think that's quite going to be the focus, but these ideas of organizing disciplines, finding ways for them to communicate, like Heather was saying, making sure that you understand the knowledge base that's needed for each individual project type. All of those are going to be definitely questions that you would get on this.
We do have a question from the group here. Jay asks, in terms of assembling a team, does the exam contain any questions or issues involving consultants that are part of a team but contracted to the owner, such as maybe a civil engineer?
Yeah, that's interesting. My guess is that, Heather, you may have some thoughts about this too, but my guess is that a complication like that would be mostly about the the very complication you just asked about. So I don't think there will be a difficult, nuanced question about the owner has a civil engineer that's working on a project, et cetera, et cetera. It's just that you should understand that there are certain consultants that sometimes are under the architectural field of influence, and certain ones that are sometimes under the owner's field of influence. And then there's some that are always essentially under the owners, and some that are always under the architects. And so you should just have a kind of a sense of the lay of the land. And civil is a really interesting one because civil is below grade. It kind of falls into that sometimes category along with the surveyors and some other folks, where they all kind of work together, and that's often over on the owner side. I don't think there'll be complicated questions, but understanding that each of the different important players, the owner, the architect, the GC, have their own. The sketch that I always do is the owner, the architect, and the GC, and then there's a bunch of satellites around each of them, and there's the subs around the GC, there are the consultants around the architect, but then there's another group of folks that are around the owner as well, which have to be bankers and funders and environmental review people and surveyors and all of those folks. And sometimes some of these folks can be going to both, which can be a little bit of a weird thing, but it won't be a complicated question, I don't think. Heather, do you have any thought about that?
No, not really. I think you hit a nail on the head, though, with the civil comment. I've seen a few test takers come in confused with where a civil contract ends and where like a plumbing contract begins, because those, like you were mentioning, one is really headed up by the owner, while one is kind of headed up by the architecture and design team.
Yeah, and it can be a little confusing.
Yeah, and it's this full circle thing again, that it's communication, because there have definitely been times that we've gone out on a job site and there is, a 6-inch gap between a plumbing line and a civil line, and well, how do you connect these two, and why didn't someone communicate where one scope line ended and one began?
And you can't just tell the water to jump. It just doesn't work that way, I don't think. Yeah, and to get back to your thing there about communication, I mean, like I've been sort of hammering on this. That's a great example of a question that, to Jay's question, that could come at you about this, which is, all right, the owner has a civil engineer, the architect has a mechanical and plumbing engineer, and blah, 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 blah situation. Well, again, it's all about the regular meetings, finding ways for them to communicate with each other, following the path of the contract, so that the mechanical engineer talks through the architect, the civil engineer talks through the owner. Hopefully, you just put them all in the same meeting, and that makes it easy. But it's all about kind of making that communication work.